It's time to create some slow-stitched patchwork. Join me today as I take a rectangular piece of slow-stitched fabric and transform it into a sewing keep. It's a tri-fold book for storing sewing supplies and taking on the go. Whether you want pockets, pouches, needle holders, or a combination of all, this project has what you need. I'm going to start by adding a patchwork border to some slow-stitched fabric. And then we're going to add a patchwork lining, pockets, a needle and pin holder, and a beautiful closure. So join me today and see how you can take your slow stitching and turn it into a beautiful sewing keep. I'm glad you're here. Let's get started. I'm starting with a piece of slow stitched fabric, and it is 5 1/4 by 13 inches, or 13 by 33 centimeters. And I created this piece of fabric in a previous video that I will link to, where I talked about 5 essential techniques for slow stitching. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create some clean edges by adding a patchwork binding or a patchwork border. So I have some small pieces of fabric, and they're about 2 inches wide. I'm using scraps here. So the size, the width of these is going to vary, the length of these is going to vary. So here's the first piece that I have, and I'm going to place it face down on the front of my stitched work. I'm going to use some clips to hold it in place, and I'm going to stitch from the back. I'm using 2 strands of embroidery floss in a color that matches most of the colors that's going on in this floral fabric. And I'm simply creating a running stitch all the way from the right to the left. And when it's stitched, I can then flip it over to create a clean edge. Then I'm going to select another piece and place it right beside that piece. I'm going to fold over my edges. I'm going to fold them under by about 1/4 of an inch, and I'm going to stitch the next piece on. So here's what it looks like when I fold that first piece over, a nice clean edge. And here I've added a second piece in this light green. You can see my edges are folded in and the patchwork is beginning to take shape. Now another way to stitch these, instead of stitching from the back, is to stitch from the front. So here I've placed a piece of fabric along this edge. I've placed the right side down, and I've worked from the front, creating a running stitch. So you can do this either way, stitching from the back or stitching from the front. And then I can take this piece and fold it over to the back, and I've got a nice clean border there. So whether you've stitched from the back or the front, once your piece is attached and you flipped it over, it's a good idea to do some top stitching. It's not necessary, but I think it adds to this piece. There's so much hand stitching on it, and it's going to secure it down as well. So I'm going to place some clips. I'm going to come from the back, and I'm going to stitch right along the edge. So I'm going to continue adding this patchwork right along the edges. So here you can see I've stitched from the front again. And when I'm bringing in my next piece, I can overlap it, clip it in place. And one way that's really helpful to stitch a straight line, you're kind of working blind in some ways, is to bring out a ruler and an erasable marker and draw the line that you want to stitch. So that's what I'm doing here. I want to continue that line as I add the new fabric, and then I can come in and continue stitching. So now I can fold both these pieces over, place some clips, and do my top stitching. I've decided this piece is long. I want to make a tri-fold book. So I'm having a look here at what I've done so far. I'm liking the way that looks. And I'm thinking about what other piece I want to add. I still have some more edging to do. So I've got another piece of this floral, and I'm going to stitch this right along this other end. I'm going to fold in the edges of my fabric, so I don't have any raw edges. It also would be fine if you wanted to have raw edges. You can do whatever is going to work for your own aesthetic and your own purposes. So I'm folding my edges under here, getting everything tucked under, and the top stitching is going to hold everything in place. So now I have all my edges covered up. I have my patchwork binding in place. I'm folding out my book and having a look at it. And before I do anything else, this is my last chance to add any more stitching or embellishment before I add a lining to the other side. So if you've added this binding and patchwork, you may want to just stop after you've added your top stitching. It really depends on the look you're going for. I'm looking at this and I usually want to add more stitching to everything. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm also going to add some more stitching right up along the edges. So I'm going to let that stitching run from the edging right into my stitched piece. I want this to look all like one piece, and this is going to bring everything together. Instead of letting those beautiful, clean, crisp edges stand out, I want them to blend in a bit more. So I'm going to add all my stitching now. And when I've completed that, I want to turn to the back and I want to stitch down all of the fabric that I've added to the edges. I've got different widths here. I've got uneven edges. It doesn't matter. I just want it all to be stitched down. I'm going to use the running stitch and I'm going to stitch down all those edges. Because this initial fabric I'm working with has been stitched on this white felt, there's a thickness there, so I don't have to worry about going all the way through to the front. Although if I did the type of stitching I've done, it's still going to look okay, so I'm not too worried about it. But I know that when I'm creating this running stitch to secure these pieces down, I can just go into my white batting and it won't go all the way through. So now that the edges are stitched down, I'm ready to add a lining. So I've gone into my stash and I found this purple gingham fabric, and I've taken an iron and I've ironed down all of the edges, and this piece is going to fit right here on this right side. And I'm bringing out my small iron and I'm ironing this in place. I've used some very thin interfacing to secure this in place. I don't often use adhesives when I'm stitching, but in this case I think it's going to work really well for me. It's going to make everything a lot easier if I can iron these down and they'll stay in place while I'm adding more stitching. So I've cut a piece of interfacing that's slightly smaller than my piece, so my edges aren't secured, but the middle part of the fabric has been ironed in place. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I have another piece of fabric here. This piece of fabric is a little bit thicker than the purple piece, and just ironing those edges down slightly isn't holding them in place. So if that ever happens, you can baste down the edges. So that's what I'm doing here. I've got some regular sewing thread and I'm going around taking tiny stitches to hold all that folded fabric in place. So now I'm ready to add this as my other piece of lining. So I've cut a piece of interfacing. Here it is. It's very thin interfacing, and I've cut it slightly smaller than my piece. And here I can just fit it on, put the piece of fabric where I want it, and then I can take my iron, secure that in place. And now that those two pieces are held, I can come in and do some hand stitching. So I've chosen some colors that I think are going to look nice here. And I'm just going to go around the edges of this lining. So here you can see I've stitched all around using straight stitches on all the edges. And I like the way that's looking. I'm going to fold my piece and have a look again. I'm liking the way that that looks. So now I'm ready to add my pockets. So I have some felt here in this bright blue color. This is a wool blend felt. It has a nice thickness to it, not too thick or too thin, and because it's felt, it's not going to fray. So this is going to work really well for a pocket. Now the width of this piece seems to be just right for the inside. And I want to create a pocket on one side, pouch on the other. So I'm going to cut a strip. Here's my strip. I'm going to cut it again so I can have a large pocket on the left. And here's the other piece I've cut. And this piece I'm going to turn into a little pocket. I'm going to fold it in the other direction and stitch it in place. I think I'll put a button on there for the opening. So I'm going to come in with a matching floss and stitch that pocket down on 3 sides. So here's my pocket stitched in place, and now I have my small pouch ready to stitch, and I've put a clip on there to hold it in place until I'm able to stitch it. And then I have one spot that I want to add a place for needles. So for my needle and pin holder, I have this piece of pink wool. This is recycled from a sock, a wool sock, and I've cut out a piece. This piece is a little bit stretchy. It's knitted, so it's really flexible. So because I've cut it out of a larger piece, I don't want it to start unraveling. So I'm going around with a matching color of floss, and I am blanket stitching all the way around. Because I'm using matching color here, it's hard to see how I'm doing this blanket stitching. So I'm going to link to another video where I go into detail on how I create blanket stitching on the edges. And then I can bring it back and put it in place. That's going to be great for holding pins and needles. So now I want to stitch this in place. So I'm going to use that same color floss that matches, and I'm going to start stitching it on. I'm going to stitch right through into that purple fabric, and I'm going to try not to come through to the front as I do that. And because this pink fabric is knitted and stretchy, and I've got almost grid lines from the purple gingham, I'm able to stitch that on in a way that's going to look nice and straight. Now I'm turning to the pocket, and I want to embellish that and also add some strength to the top of the pocket. So I'm going to add some trim. So I have this blue trim. So I'm going to come in with embroidery floss in the corner of that pocket, and then I'm going to hold that trim in place and hold the pocket, and I'm going to stitch all the way along using the running stitch. Now I'm going to turn to the folded pocket, and I'm going to stitch along the sides. The bottom is folded, but I have the 2 sides to stitch, as well as I want to add blanket stitching to the top. So I'm going to start on the one side, stitch right at the fold. I'm going to work all the way up, and then when I get to the part that folds over, I'm going to keep going to add that blanket stitching all the way around, and then work all the way to the other side. So here I've stitched from the left all the way across the top to the other side. I have this nice pocket that's going to fit really nicely in here. So before I stitch it in place, I want to add a closure. So I've chosen 2 buttons. I'm going to put one on the flap and one below it. So I've stitched those in place, and then I'm taking some embroidery floss. I've chosen some pearl cotton. It's twisted, so it's less likely to unravel. And I'm going to make a twisted closure. So I'm going to come in and stitch this down. So the thing to remember when I'm stitching this down is I want to stay loose, meaning I don't want this pocket to be completely flat. I want to move it in a little bit so that there's a little bit of give. So if I just move it over here on this side to the left a little bit, instead of trying to pull it really tight, then I'm going to have some ability to put things in that pocket without creating too much strain. I've also got those grid lines to help me put this on straight. So I'm going to move along that side. And I have this closure I've created with this pearl cotton where I can do a figure 8 to tie that on. and then I've knotted the end of that pearl cotton size 8 so that it doesn't unravel. And you can see I didn't stitch along the top, so there's actually another pocket that's created behind that pocket. So one option here is to create a sewing roll. So this would just be rolled like this, and that's how you store everything. And then you could have a ribbon to keep it closed. And then the other option is the tri-fold, which I've been doing here. And that's what I'm going to do here. And don't forget that the roll might be a good option depending on what you're going to use it for and what your needs are. So I want to do a similar type of button closure where I'm going to use buttons held together with a figure 8 ribbon or string. So I'm putting one button in this pale green color right on the front. So I've decided after attaching this first button that I want to take this green thread and I want to add it to the border. So I'm going to continue my stitching. I'm going to embellish this border some more while I'm here. And then you can see here that I decided to add even more stitching and embellishment in the green area in particular. So I've added a bunch of stitching along my border. And I've also added another button in that purpley pink color right there. So now I can fold my piece up and those two buttons will meet. And then I'm going to use this ribbon. I'm going to tie it onto the one button, and then I'll be able to use that to wrap around the other button to secure it. So here's what I'm going to be using my sewing keep for. The pocket on the left is the perfect size for me to add some scraps of fabric, perfect for working and creating on the go. The little pouch on the right is just the right size to put in a few bobbins of floss. And then the central part is where I can store my needles. So you can customize this any way you want. Particularly the pocket on the left, you could even divide it in half. I'm really happy with the way that this has turned out. I like the size of it. It's much bigger than other needle books that I have. So this is going to be a really good on-the-go companion for stitching. I hope I've given you some ideas about making your own custom sewing keep. You can make this in any size you like. The possibilities are endless. Thank you so much for joining me today. Until next time, happy stitching.